Well, it's time for our news review. Sally's here. We're going to look at the stories making headlines around the world. Let's start with The Independent, leading on UK Prime Minister Theresa May warning Britain to prepare for crashing out of the EU without a deal.
Irish Times looks at what's going on in Spain, of course, and Catalonia's president, who is to address the parliament today, with many supporters hoping for a unilateral declaration of independence. So will he or won't he?
The Arab News leads on fears of a civil war over the disputed city of Kirkuk if talks over Kurdish independence from Iraq are left unresolved.
In France, the main daily there, Le Figaro, is saying workers' unions are enlisting civil servants in their fight against Emmanuel Macron, his Labour reform plans.
The Guardian carries a warning that the cost of treating global ill health caused by obesity will exceed $1.2 trillion yearly, every year from the year 2025.
And finally, the Evening Standard is following Syria's World Cup dream. They've defied expectations to reach this far in qualifying and will play Australia later.
Right, let's kick off. Sorry. Joining us is Oliver Cornock, who's Editor-in-Chief of the Oxford Business Group. Ollie, good to see you.
Morning, Ollie. Nice to see you.
Right. We've spoken before about the risks facing Britain if it crashes out of the EU without a deal. This time, this is an official strategy for how to cope with that if it happens.
Yes, it seems a bit more polish on Theresa May, UK Prime Minister's mantra, no deal's better than a bad deal. The trouble is we're getting a bit more detail what a bad deal might include, and this talks to queues at borders, both for travellers and goods, all of these things that might be left unresolved, really coming to have a practical impact on daily life. And part of me thinks, well, Theresa May is only doing her job to start talking in real terms about this. At the same time, it plays to infighting with her own party, still very divided on the approach to Brexit. All the opposition parties, of course, gunning for her, saying that actually this is too dramatic, there's not a conciliatory enough tone. So it's a very difficult position for her. And, of course, she's come out last week in Florence saying the ball is now in the EU's court. And, of course, predictably, they've said exactly the same. The ball is in your court.
So she's put out the worst-case scenario in a way, hasn't she? And as you say, preparing everybody for what may or may not happen if there is a crashing out at the end of negotiations. How do you think she fared, given last week's speech at the Conservative Party conference, which was a bit of a disaster on many fronts? How did she seem yesterday, from your point of view? Well,
after, as you say, a bit of a train crash last week at the party conference, it can only be up. But this doesn't seem to be up very far. This is quite a bleak outlook. But as I say, perhaps she's just doing the right thing by positioning and posturing, because we have to get through these initial negotiations on the divorce bill before we can get talking about the trade bill. And, of course, that's the future. UK trade with Europe is really significant and really important.
Many are arguing that, you know, by doing this yesterday in Parliament, she's putting more and more pressure on Brussels to say we're ready for anything. We will not, you know, we will not basically negotiate because we're desperate. We're not desperate at all. We've got every sort of base covered. Is that the response she's going to get in Brussels, or is that what they'll read between the lines in Brussels?
I think that's a different angle. She's received a huge amount of criticism. If she weren't being firm and positioning herself like this, the critics would have even more to chuck at her.
OK, something else the people in Brussels will be watching very closely is events in Catalonia. Big repercussions if the Catalans do go completely independent. The Irish Times covering this, as many other papers are. He may or he may not declare, this is the leader of the Catalan government, declare independence unilaterally.
He seems to have moderated his language, doesn't he? And I think, Ben, as you say, this is something that Brussels will be really alarmed by. We've seen how the Northern Ireland question has played into Brexit discussions. Any secession from part of a state always receives huge levels of opprobrium in Brussels, and it should be no surprise that the EU's waded in here. But I think more broadly, this just shows that the language and the rhetoric has actually moderated a bit. Remember, I think it's important that only 48% of the voters came out, of which 90% apparently voted for independence. That's still less than half of the regional population in a referendum that wasn't endorsed by Madrid. So politically, you have to question the basis of that. But I'm pleased to see sort of moderating language, hopefully.
We'll see what the President of Catalonia says
a lot of
later
attention
today.
on that session.
All eyes will be on him, that's for sure. It's a cliché, but I think in that case it's
6
true.
o'clock Spanish time.
6 o'clock Spanish time.
Right, Arab news. This headline on their front page: Iraqi Vice President sees danger of civil war over Kirkuk. You know this part of the world extremely well. Talk us through what's going on here.
You know, this is one of those intractable situations. Another headline, as I was saying to Ben earlier, with a war in the headline on a paper in the Arab world, sends alarm bells ringing. The simple fact is that Kirkuk was outside of the Kurdish autonomous region, and the Kurds took over Kirkuk, if you like, administered it. It was always under Baghdad before. So this is actually part of a steady increase and encroachment of the Kurdish area of Iraq, and plays to what I've been saying for a long time, what a lot of us who watch this region say, that actually Iraq, as we knew it historically, is no longer.
It's being carved up,
It's being carved up, and we have to get beyond the idea that it can go back to its integral form. So when Alawi is saying that the president of the vice president of Iraq is saying that negotiations need to succeed, there's huge pressure here. Now, I'm just pleased he's talking about negotiations and the fear of war, because we know this is a region racked by war. I mean, to coin a phrase, the people here don't want another war, and I'm really pleased to see there's some constructive dialogue there. But Russia, of course, is looking in as well. Turkey and Iran have a vested interest. Both of them have restive Kurdish populations.
That's what I was going to ask you, Ollie. I mean, who holds the initiative in averting his fear of a civil war?
Well, it's a good point, because, of course, with perhaps both Barzani in the Kurdish region and the Iraqi president have got too much of a vested interest. Perhaps it's to look out to Turkey and Iran to get involved. And we keep talking about some sort of negotiated solution to this, but I don't see people coming to the table very willingly, and it's a good point. Who's going to start driving this?
I've already talked about France and the day ahead there. A quick comment from you on that, Ollie?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think Macron's relatively powerful in terms of his reform strategy. He's very unpopular at the moment, but you have to say he's going to be. The other point is that these laws have been passed. It seems to me that it's all well and good the unions get strangely united for French unions getting against this, but actually these laws are already on the statute book.
I mean, talking about his unpopularity is quite normal, isn't it? When someone's been elected after the honeymoon period, for it to be quite short, especially if you're pushing through reform on this scale. I mean, this is big reform he's trying to push through in the public sector.
And we're seeing leaders all over the world at the moment, relatively newly elected leaders, having huge popularity plummets. That's nothing strange.
And just briefly, of course, whenever there are strikes in France, if it involves air traffic controllers, it not only affects people flying there into France, but also at times flying across France. So it's only be aware of if you're travelling, and your flight takes you over France, be prepared perhaps for delays. Guardian next.
Yes, the Guardian.
We should all get hitting the treadmill by the sounds of this. Global cost of obesity exceeding $1.2 trillion by 2025. $1.2 trillion a year.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting story. I mean, in the developed world, we've been talking about health, lifestyle-related illnesses and costs for a really long time. It's really interesting from my point of view. At Oxford Business Group, we look at emerging markets, developing economies. This is becoming a really big problem. If I look at the Gulf and the Middle East, huge levels of obesity, which leads to diabetes, heart disease. These, in turn, become huge systemic burdens on the state. So, actually, it's becoming a global problem, as The Guardian is saying, a huge bill, and it comes down to all sorts of things. But the simple fact is you don't put on what you don't put in.
That's true.
You are what you eat.
I like that.
You are what you eat. And the Evening Standard celebrating Syria's football team. Nice to have a good news story coming out of Syria.
This is wonderful. A story about Syria which hasn't got war or killing in the headline. Wonderful. Great news for Syria. Wherever I go in the world, you can go to the wackiest place, people want to talk about football. It's a wonderful uniting sport, and you just have to hope that there's some glimmer of positivity here for the Syrian people.
Indeed, and the other minnows that are through, the Icelandic team.
Yeah. Yes.
And do you know, they don't let you forget it, because they got through to the... they beat England, didn't they?
Yes.
In the
we
European...
won't forget that one,
The European... Yeah, and they don't let you forget it. When I was there, every 5 minutes, like, oh, you're from Britain, we beat you. No, well, actually, it's England you beat, but yeah, they don't let you forget it, and with good reason, you know.
Absolutely.
Ollie, thank you very much indeed. Really good to get your thoughts on all of those. Covered a huge amount of ground there, but lovely to end on that sort of positive note, as you say. A story about Syria that doesn't involve war.
Thank you too for your company. If you are watching us on BBC One, you'll be joining the breakfast team in 5 minutes. If you're with BBC World News, I'm afraid you're stuck with me and Ben.
Speak for yourself. We'd be delighted to have you.
Stay with us wherever you are. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.